By earth, wind, and fire, climate change is affecting lives worldwide. For the worse.
At least 36 people have died in southern Brazil after a powerful cyclone unleashed heavy wind and rains.
The alarming scale of the devastation left by Hurricane Ada.
Downpour flooded 5 small rivers and swept large debris from surrounding mountains.
So what's the solution? And what is the world doing to stop it? Hi, this is Karin Zissis of ASCOA Online, and in this episode, we're going to talk about Brazil's role in fighting the issue, specifically with respect to the big, bad final boss, carbon emissions. When we think about reaching net zero emissions by 2050, it's hard not to get discouraged. Negotiations are complicated, and companies and governments alike are struggling to create the necessary infrastructure for a green, decarbonized economy. Simply put, the world just isn't working fast enough to emit less carbon.
The situation we are witnessing now is the demonstration that climate change is out of control.
But in Brazil, a country responsible for 3% of global emissions, things are changing. After years of international pressure, the country appears to be making up for lost time. It decreased deforestation by 33% in the first half of the year. It launched a green transition package worth billions, and it even upped the ante on its Paris Agreement promise, setting carbon emissions cuts to 53% by 2030.
Temos potencial de energia eólica extraordinário. Nós temos potencial de energia solar extraordinário. Nós agora...
When you're home to 2/3 of the largest rainforest in the world, you can make a serious impact. The Amazon absorbs more greenhouse gases than any rainforest in the world. So by leaving it be, Brazil is one of the few continental countries that can actually become carbon negative. Its role in this race against time is crucial. But besides from just potentially saving humanity, Brazil has the business opportunity of a lifetime, the carbon market. This month, the Brazilian Senate approved a bill that would regulate companies releasing more than 10,000 tons of CO2 per year. The bill still needs to pass through the lower house and doesn't include the high-emitting agribusiness sector, but regulating carbon credits in Brazil could represent a market of more than $20 billion by 2030. Experts today consider it one of the most effective ways to finance a transition to a green economy in any country.
It's important to have a higher price of activities that actually imply in substantial greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to put a price on these emissions to discourage consumption and production of these goods and services.
That's Professor Emilio Rovere. He's the head of the Center for Integrated Studies on Climate Change and the Environment at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He's a co-author of many IPCC reports, the documents quantifying emissions and telling how we're doing on climate change. He's also advised Brazil's government and researched how to go green since the 80s. Rovere spoke with my colleague Luisa Leme. They talked about why the country has a comparative advantage when it comes to carbon markets and why Latin American countries still need to work together with industrialized countries to get the world close to a net zero economy.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Professor Emilio Rovere, thank you so much for being in Latin American Focus, speaking with me today.
It's my pleasure to be here and hope you enjoy the conversation today.
Emilio, we had a drastic change in government this year in Brazil, and in a way, it feels like everything changed in the country when it comes to climate change policy. Brazil revised its goals to cut greenhouse gas emissions. It revised up, so from something like 37% to now 48% by 2025. And I would like to know, what would you say is the most important push this new government in Brazil is is doing to get the country back on track on meeting those goals?
We got back to the same absolute level of ceilings of emissions by 2025 and by 2030 that were announced in Paris in 2015. So this is the main already result in this initial months. And of course, in Brazil, there is a very relevant role of greenhouse emissions from deforestation, mainly in the Amazon and in the savanna region called Cerrado. And the government is struggling to reduce these annual emissions due to the annual deforestation rates, which had really skyrocketed in the previous 4 years. There was a significant, substantial reduction this year. I trust that next figures will be better. So I think these are the two initial steps. And this morning, on the 4th of October, we got good news from the Brazilian Senate that approved a version still to be confirmed by the Chamber of Deputies of a carbon market in Brazil. In the domestic carbon market regulated by the government, which will be very important to convey a signal to the economic agents covered by the market. All the business with an emission over 10,000 tons of CO2 per year, you have to report, and those with higher emissions than 25,000 tons of CO2 per year will have quotas, will have caps that will have to be followed.
We know that there is contentions with the agribusiness sector. Tell me, what do you think about the legislation? Is there a piece missing?
Apparently, what was approved today, 4th of October, in the Senate, is that the agriculture sector will not be part of the scope. Mm-hmm. There are difficulties related to the accounting, for instance, of methane emissions from beef production, from cattle raising, because you have a supply chain that have a number of suppliers since you get to slaughtering and get your beef. And of course, there is also the action of the lobbies, the political negotiations. We will have to have complementary measures. We have already going on ABC plan, that means low carbon agriculture, for the acronym in Portuguese. And this program is widening up the adoption of low carbon practice. There are other possibilities of restraining the credit to ranching and agricultural activities that are not in compliance with environmental regulations.
Will it make a difference globally once Brazil regulates the carbon market?
Generally speaking, it's important to have a higher price of activities that actually imply in substantial greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to put a price on these emissions to discourage consumption and production of these goods and services. This can be done by a tax by the government or by the creation of a cap, a limit in the quantities that can be emitted in 1 year. So some Latin American countries went for the carbon tax, as it's called, way, Chile, for instance. Other, like Mexico, have already a prototype carbon market. And now Brazil is also adopting that modality. And this will make more attractive activities that emit less and technologies that emit less. And on the contrary, will jeopardize activities that are very carbon intensive. So the idea is to induce investors and the business to technological shifts, energy efficiency, use of renewables, and other measures that can cut down emissions will become more attractive in the cash flow of these projects. And this signal that will be sent to the businesses in Brazil will make more palatable, more acceptable for energy-intensive industry like steel, cement, for instance, sectors, to go green. And globally, this means that the carbon footprint of Brazilian steel, that's already much lower than the Chinese one, for instance, will be in a better position to compete in the global markets, to export to North America or Europe and other parts of the globe. And as you know, there are also laws and regulations being prepared by the European Union, and already the intention of North American governments, the US and Canada, to follow suit and also apply, if Brazilian steel has not a carbon tax on it and has not a carbon market to limit its cap, they will face taxation at the border in European Union, and this is bound to start next year. So this is also important to make Brazilian competitiveness of Brazilian industrial products better in the global competition. What is required to make green steel? Today, what we got, mainly blast furnaces fueled by coke from coal. But there are other industrial processes that can deliver the same quality of steel. This is not from one day to another, but the fact that we're starting a carbon pricing scheme through a cap and trade system that will be stricter and stricter in the future can allow the business to plan for a technological shift ahead of time. The industry has to adapt. We have to accommodate for the costs, avoid to have losers. No one has to be left behind. We have to ensure a just transition. And that's the way we can go, for instance, with steel. I foresee for the next decades a substantial revolution in the way we produce steel, because we will still be needing steel for wind energy, for solar energy, and other renewables.
You said before in lectures that Brazil has a comparative advantage in relation to other countries when it comes to carbon market. Why does Brazil have this advantage?
This is thanks to the extensive base of natural resources in the country. And we already have, for instance, for power generation, more than 80% of Brazilian electricity comes from renewables, hydropower, wind, solar, biomass, renewable biomass. So this is an important competitive advantage because all the industries that use electricity are using nearly clean electricity. And this level of 80% is bound to increase in the future. For energy as a whole, if you take also fuels for transport and industry, we have overall, including electricity, 45% of Brazilian energy supply comes from renewable. This is substantially higher than what we see in the most advanced economies around the world. So that's where the basic competitive advantage comes from. That means that in order to go further and get to net zero emissions by 2050, the cost, either by taxation or the quotas, the caps that we can impose on our business, will be softer than in other parts of the world. For instance, this high-level commission on carbon price headed by Joe Stiglitz and Nicholas Stern that I had the honor to integrate, we calculate on average for the world that the price signal would be something around $40 to $80 by 2020 for each ton of CO2 in terms of the added price to make emissions decrease to a pathway that would go to net zero by 2050. Brazilian studies would show that in Brazil, we won't need to go beyond $50 per ton up to 2050. And we cannot forget that all taxation or all carbon markets increase business costs, have impacts on inflation. There are winners and losers, but the burden will be much lower in Brazil and can be more than compensated by the boom in renewables, by the growth of the bioeconomy and other green economic sectors, and actually the GDP, the economic activity level can be respected, can not be negatively jeopardized by a carbon market. That's the main difference in Brazil.
You raised the fact that this transition needs to be fair, that people cannot be left behind. When talking about a way of financing investment and building this low carbon economy in these different steps, there's a divide between industrialized economies and the developing global south. So does being active in a carbon market give countries like Brazil and other countries in Latin America more power in future negotiations?
As usual, we have some barriers to transition to a net zero economy in developing countries that are mainly related to capital and technology availability. That's always the problem of developing countries. And we need access to technologies and access to financial resources to fund the investments, the upfront costs of all these opportunities that we're mentioning of changing shifts in industrial process or in equipments to renewables and more energy efficient processes. The problems that developing countries have higher risks for the investor, political risks, exchange rate risks, regulatory risks, and others. So we need partnerships with the industrialized economies and with multilateral financial organisms and also the banks from industrialized countries to partner with local institutions and local investors to have public-private partnerships that can decrease, de-risk the investments and reduce the capital costs that are faced to cover the upfront costs. Renewables energy efficiency will pay along 20, 30 years of a life cycle investment. But the problem is how to overcome the barrier of funding the upfront costs. So it's important to have countries and institutions with AAA rating in the financial market from the industrialized countries as a leverage to attract other financial institutions and also private investors, institutional investors, pension funds, and so on, also from the host countries. As usual, the last stage of the value chain with much more added value, say, as in petrochemicals, as in aluminium, as in other products, even steel, are continuing to be in the industrialized countries. What Brazil basically manufactures is basic steel that is exported to the US, for instance, and the finishing is done in the US. Of course, there is competition, but there is also a wide scope for cooperation in view of accelerating the transition. But we need to work it together. We cannot just blame China and blame developing countries because they need to develop. And we need this cooperation.
What are some of the political reasons for the carbon market now? How does this relate to the current government's global role and ambitions?
Then there is also the voluntary market, the voluntary carbon market that actually is not exactly imposing a cap on the Brazilian enterprise, but on the contrary, on the supply of carbon credits, of emission reductions that can be bought by businesses. This is also an important opportunity to fund bioeconomy, restoration of degraded land in the Amazon, keep the forest in the ground, and to make it grow. There is plenty of land available for forestry projects. There is also a spin-off of the regulated carbon market on the voluntary carbon market, because you know that there have been, for instance, this year, many echoes from the media of projects that were just greenwashing in the voluntary market and were not really reducing emissions. So the fact that you have a regulated market will high up the bar to avoid any bad surprise for the investor who comes to invest in the voluntary market. So this needs judgment. And in order to increase the quality of these carbon credits standing out from the voluntary carbon market, it's very positive to have a regulated market.
You talk about the difficulty about financing, and I read the IMF says that 80% of climate financing in the next decades will have to come from the private sector. How do we overcome this risky business feeling when it comes to banking? How do we make sectors to think about carbon credits the same way that they think about lithium nowadays?
I think there is no other option out of public-private partnerships. We need the public sector to be there. We had the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, signed between a club of industrialized countries with countries like South Africa, Vietnam, and Indonesia. For instance, the US, together with UK and Germany and Italy, put some $9 billion on the table to help South Africa to go out from coal for clean power generation. And part of it is concessional loans from the public funds. Part of it is business opportunities for the private sector. And the importance of guarantee funds with public guarantees that ensure the credibility and reduce the risks, make the private capital to flow. And I think Brazil is struggling now to get back its investment grade. It's still not the case. Capital cost in Brazil sometimes can be seen as higher than in South Africa or in Indonesia. So we need badly something like a Just Energy Transition Partnership, similar to what is the Amazon Fund. That means you start at a very top levels that the two presidents meet and a US president say, we are going to support the effort to keep the forest in the Amazon. So that's the way also to go for low carbon infrastructure. How get from this traffic out of these traffic jams by roads that are burning a lot of oil products like diesel oil and gasoline and so on? Or how can we get to proper electrified, clean transport in cities, in intercity cargo? Brazil does not have the railway system that the US has for cargo transportation. We need to build that. And hydroways as well. So all this low carbon infrastructure will pay for the investment, but will take time. And the upfront cost is not affordable by Brazil alone.
You've co-authored several IPCC reports. You're part of the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices. That is a report that kind of set up this framework and set up those prices. So you're thinking of this new framework for countries' economies while we are still reducing emissions and decarbonizing. I need to ask you what worries you? What makes you lose your sleep, Emilio? And what makes you hopeful?
Yes. Sustainable development was defined as development that would not harm future generations. But at the same time, to be sustainable also has to be socially sustainable. That means solidarity with current generations that are more vulnerable, low-income groups. There is a kind of compromise between the two that has to be sought, because we need to leave a better world to our grandchildren, but we also need to take care of the poor. We need to have a lot of complementary policies that, for instance, a share of the revenues that will be eventually earned by the government from a domestic cap and trade system. First, we have to ensure that it's revenues that the government is getting from the industry will go back to the economy. And then it has to go back in a good way. That means, for instance, decreasing charge on employment, social charge that an entrepreneur, a businessman, he knows that if he wants to pay a salary in Brazil, he has to account for 2.5 times that salary in terms of all the expenses incurred in creating a job. Another share of these revenues could go as a carbon fellowship, as we call in Brazil. We have social fellowships for for the low-income groups, households that will be harmed because there will be an increase in the general price level. This is unavoidable. Have to be protected from that. So we need to reconcile the two challenges. Have a clean planet for next generations and be fair with those who deserve a better fate today.
Are you hopeful about that?
I think that in this moment in Brazil, I'm less pessimistic than 1 year before.
Okay, Emilio, thank you so much for participating in Latin America in Focus.
Thank you for the attention. We hope we have other opportunities to continue this talk that is in the interest of all.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Karin Zissis. This episode was produced by Luisa Leme and John Orbach. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the Americas Society and Council of the Americas or its members. The music in this podcast was performed for the Americas Society. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. We hope you enjoyed this episode. You can access other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast and send us feedback at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you for joining us.